Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Engineering Dean's Gender Equity EDGE College Self-Assessment Tool. My name is Greta Leibniz, and I serve as co-PI and project director for the EDGE initiative, and will serve as your host for today's webinar. With me is Dr. Kimberly Griffin, associate professor in the College of Education at the University of Maryland, and Dr. Alan Mabe, formerly Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and Chief Academic Officer at the Association for Public Land-Grant Universities. So I want to start by noting that for those of you seeking evidence-based actions in support of gender diversity, equity, and inclusion, I encourage you to review the prior EDGE Showcase webinar. Virginia Valian was our keynote, and she's a leading researcher on gender equity in STEM. One of Dr. Valian's key points was based on EDGE data collected earlier this year from 90 ASW engineering deans. And what we found in one key takeaway was that deans say they hold leaders accountable. And this is especially noteworthy for subtle inequities like teaching and service loads. However, from the survey results, there was a clear disconnect between deans' intentions and dean action, in that data revealed that although deans have good intentions to support gender equity, diversity, and inclusion, most are not collecting the data necessary to hold leaders accountable. For example, 92% of deans say they hold faculty leaders accountable for assigning fair and equitable teaching loads. However, only 32% of deans say they track loads by gender. Another example is 87% of deans say they hold faculty leaders accountable for assigning fair and equitable service loads. Again, only 26% of deans say that they actually track service loads by gender. So how can you hold people accountable if you don't collect the data? At the very least, it's important to track key variables like salary by gender. However, only 72% of our dean sample said that they tracked salary by gender. So the second key takeaway from the Valian webinar was, in order to foster a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment, deans must collect gender equity data and establish benchmarks for progress. And that is our primary goal for today's webinar. So I will briefly set the stage regarding the development of the EDGE two-part self-assessment tool. Dr. Griffin will provide details about the model and the APLU institutional tool that serves as a foundation for the EDGE college self-assessment tool. And then Dr. Mabe will share lessons learned from pilot institutions using the APL tool. So the first thing the EDGE initiative team did was to review NSF advanced gender equity indicators, surveys, tools, indices. And for those not familiar with the advanced program, briefly, this is an NSF program that was funded since 2002. It was funded to address barriers to the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women faculty in STEM disciplines, and is now more oriented to addressing barriers associated with gender as broadly defined. So in 2005, after a lot of work by leaders in that first cohort, the advanced NSF indicators were finalized, and these indicators addressed 4 questions and required collection of data associated with each question. The first question is, what is the distribution of science and engineering faculty by gender, rank, and department? And the type of data collected to answer this question includes the number of tenure and tenure track faculty by department, rank, and gender. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm not going to go into detail, but we'll provide you with a handout afterwards about the NSF indicators. The second question is, what are the outcomes of the institutional processes of recruitment and advancement for women and men? Data collected to answer this question includes things like the number of faculty who submitted tenure packets and were awarded tenure by gender and department. A third question is, what is the gender distribution of science and engineering faculty in leadership positions in the institution? And the fourth question is, what is the allocation of resources for science and engineering faculty by gender at the institution? The required data collected was startup package information and study of salaries by gender. So we concluded that, yes, the advanced indicators were a great foundation for the desired college-level self-assessment tool, but that data was predominantly quantitative. And in order to understand gender equity numbers, we felt it important to be informed about the context that produces those numbers. So to put deans in a position to develop informed change plans. And we were also aware that with almost 2 decades of advanced funded gender equity research, that barriers to women's academic STEM engagement were emerging, such as impact of family, gender bias in evaluations, everything from faculty bias in recruitment, mentoring, and advancement opportunities, to student bias in teaching evaluations, and inequitable distribution of resources as well as teaching and service loads. We also knew from research that women from U.S. historically disadvantaged groups face similar but additional barriers to that of white women, and we wanted our self-assessment tool to capture this phenomenon of bias based on intersectionality of gender and race. So, with an eye to this evidence, we reviewed additional self-assessment tools such as the AAC&U's Gender Values, which provides a great self-assessment for institutional family friendliness. And you've got a link to that if you're interested in that type of self-assessment, and a recent advanced funded gender equity index by Diana Bellamoria and Sophie Jane. Finally, as a function of work with includes Aspire Alliance, I met Drs Griffin and Mabe and became familiar with APLU's comprehensive institutional faculty diversity self-assessment tool, which addressed all of our interests, including intersectionality of gender and race. Their 2-part tool incorporated quantitative data similar to the advanced NSF indicators and qualitative questions similar to AAC&U's Gender Values Survey and Bellamoria and Jane's Gender Equity Index. And the APLU tool had the added benefit of being used as the foundation for AAAS's Sea Change Award. So, with consultation by Dr. Griffin and Mabe, we modified the APLU faculty diversity tool to target the college level and be specific to academic engineering and gender diversity, equity, and inclusion. And because of our review of research, we created a tool that would help deans, 1, inform corrective action, 2, provide quality data for external funding requests that would help affect the change desired. And here's some examples of those funding sources. 3, demonstrate award-winning improvement. 4, set College of Engineering deans to be in a position to help lead institutional diversity work, which might set them up for further awards and recognition. And eventually, and finally, provide a means of comparison with college peer institutions and with national benchmarks. Now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Griffin.
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you today, sharing some of this work that we've been doing at APLU, thinking about how we see institutional self-assessments as nested in larger questions and conversations in larger frameworks. So first, I want to start with how we thought about and approached the problem. I think better understanding of the problem that we're trying to address, how we increase faculty diversity, really informs how we understand what's happening in campuses, in our departments, and helps us determine what we ultimately want to assess. So I want to start by saying that, and Gretel mentioned this a little bit earlier, that our thinking about faculty diversity included women, certainly, but we were thinking about women and men of color, being very mindful of intersectionality, really trying to get a broad understanding of when we talk about issues related to faculty diversity, particularly in science, how do people define the problem? And just last week, I saw a perfect example of this happen on Twitter, the all-knowing Twitter, right? That there was a post that went up where a woman faculty member was talking about the lack of racial diversity in a pool for a faculty search. And she said, she talked about how it was, so unfortunate and how she was so upset about it. But her first comment about it was that the pool is very small, and recounted some data that talked about the number of PhDs that we have from underrepresented minority groups. This led to quite a response from the academic Twitter community. And largely it was pushing back a little bit, that folks were acknowledging the pool being an issue. But I bring up on the screen a tweet from my colleague Kenny Gibbs, who's been a dear friend and collaborator on much of my work, focusing on career development in biomedical science and how folks think about their career aspirations, noting that there's not enough people is really an outdated argument, and that there in fact has been growth and there has been progress in terms of the number of individuals from underrepresented minority groups and women that are graduating with degrees in science, but we're not seeing those individuals enter the faculty ranks, and we really need to get an understanding of why that's the case. So as we look to the larger discourse and the larger literature, I'd like you to focus on the core of the figure that you see here on the left. There are three common narratives that we often hear that really align with the Twitter discourse that I just mentioned when we start thinking about what are the root causes and why are we having such persistent inequality in terms of the number of women, the number of men of color that are in faculty positions, particularly in science colleges and departments and programs. The first being, it's really an issue of numbers, that we don't have enough individuals entering and successfully completing graduate programs in science. So we certainly aren't going to see increases in the numbers of faculty members from underrepresented backgrounds if we don't see significant increases in graduate education. The second discourse that we hear a lot about is that it's an issue with hiring, that ultimately, and the hiring discussion has two prongs. One being that there are candidates, they just don't have the criteria or don't have the different components and the skills that we're looking for in faculty. So they're not exceptional enough to be hired. And the other prong of that argument being that hiring committees are biased, that they are not looking for or honoring the skills and the unique contributions that women, men of color might be bringing to the academy, and that they're often missed in our searches, and that we don't do enough to really identify up and coming talent, particularly when we're talking about individuals from underrepresented groups. And then final discourse that we hear is that when we talk about faculty diversity, we think too much about hiring and recruitment, that this is actually a retention problem, that we have a lot of folks who are leaving the academy and that we really need to attend more to that piece of the conversation. So Gretel, I'm going to ask you to bring up poll, which narratives you have heard most often in your college. Do you hear people saying when they look to their issues around faculty diversity that really it's an issue of pipeline, that it's an issue of hiring, that they're really thinking about retention issues, or they're not talking about any of these discourses at all? So which one are they using most? I know you may hear multiple discourses, but which one seems to be the most prevalent in your college?
And here's the results.
Okay, so this is pretty consistent with what we see in the literature and what we see in the media, and that what we saw in the Twitter post, that oftentimes we look to the pipeline being the problem, saying that like, well, if we just had more individuals, we would have more individuals to hire, and certainly, you know, everything would be good. And that's where we really need to focus our attention. That kind of narrative is very person-centered and is more deficit-oriented, that we need to fix the people and push more people into the pipeline, and that ultimately things will take care of itself. Demography will take care of itself as long as we have more people. If we look at the literature and we look at the narratives of individuals that are actually in these systems, we'll see that, you know, these three root causes are all really integrated in the experiences of women and men of color in the academy, and that they all have a part to play in the persistent underrepresentation that we see. And I would say that we need to shift away from this person-centered, deficit-oriented thinking to systems thinking and equity-focused thinking, where we're thinking about structures, systems, and how our institutions continue to perpetuate these inequalities, and how we're addressing all three of these narratives all at one time, rather than focusing on one that's more person-centered and that shifts the responsibility away from the institute. So as we do that, there are a few things that we acknowledged about this process, that we really think of increasing faculty diversity as a multidimensional process. There is no one bullet that's going to address it, particularly if the problem is multiple prongs and is multiple dimensions, that actions must take place at all levels, that it's not a departmental problem or a college problem or an institution problem. It's everybody's concern and everyone needs to be engaged, and that we also need to think about partnering with other institutions as we move forward in doing this work. So as we started to think about how we could do and develop a self-assessment that ultimately would be helpful to institutions and help them understand how they're moving forward in terms of addressing faculty diversity issues, it was important for us to actually develop a framework to guide the work. And there were a certain set of goals that we had in developing the framework. First, we wanted to have a way to really understand and offer a way to understand the complexities of faculty diversity work that was consistent with the complexity of the effort that it would take to make change. So we wanted to make sure that our framework was integrated, that it was focused on the institution, and that it really offered a way to guide practice. Secondly, as Alan and I particularly started this process together, we started generating a list of questions. And the list of questions was helpful, but they were very micro level. And we wanted to really acknowledge the fact that individual questions that are kind of scattered all over the place don't really offer you a clear path forward. That ultimately we thought it would be most helpful to develop a map that we could use, that you can always bring these questions back to larger problems and larger issues that you could address across the institution rather than trying to fix individual things and checking individual things off of a list. So how do we go beyond seeing individual data points and develop larger, more comprehensive narratives about what's happening on our campus? And third, we wanted to develop a framework that was going to be able to offer stakeholders a way to understand their role in the process, how their role is in relation to the roles of others, and how everybody could work together in concert, in collaboration towards the same goals. So to understand not only how individuals within the context of the institution would be able to move things forward, but how they could be more effective partners with individuals outside of institutions to approach specific dimensions of the faculty diversity puzzle that would be the most effective and the most helpful. So we took a very intentional process towards developing our framework and developing the institutional self-assessment itself. It wasn't something that we sat alone in a room and did, although that's how it kind of started, that we did a preliminary draft of both the framework and the institutional self-assessment based on a review of the literature. And Alan and I sat together and met together and did multiple iterations until we felt like we had a draft that we were comfortable with sharing. And then we shared it really widely, consistent with a collective impact approach and, our goals associated with the APLU Includes project. We shared what we had done with the APLU Includes leadership team. We shared it with our faculty diversity task force, which was a specific task force within our larger grant that was focused on helping us really think through and refine the work that we were doing in this area. So leading scholars, leading practitioners, they were all doing work around diversity and inclusion, helped us hone our thinking. And then we shared our model with the APLU Council of Presidents and Council on Academic Affairs. And we also shared it at the APLU Includes summits in both 2017 and 2018. So ultimately, after we got all of this feedback, we were able to develop a framework that reflects, of course, literature and theory, also integrates some really key perspectives from individuals who are on the ground, working with different populations, working on faculty diversity issues every day. And also, we were able to engage in some outside of the box thinking. They were able to offer some ideas that aren't necessarily chronicled in the literature, but draw on theory or draw on research in interesting ways to suggest how we think that this process actually happens and how faculty diversity can be improved. So ultimately, this is what we came up with. We decided that we wanted to offer an integrated framework that, again, touched on how we address those three core problems that I mentioned at the beginning. That there are issues associated with the number of individuals who are completing graduate programs and that are expressing interest in pursuing faculty careers. How do we address the fact that there are issues associated with hiring? And how do we address the fact that there are issues with retention? So as you'll see, our model has three core boxes at the center, that we have a set of ideas around recruitment and how we think about recruiting and questions that we ask in relation to recruitment. We have a set of questions around how we facilitate better transitions into the institution. And then finally, we have a set of questions around how we retain faculty and how we keep them at our institutions. All of these boxes are nested in the larger institutional context. So understanding how issues related to climate, the commitment of senior leaders relate to these processes is really important as well. As you can see, there's lots of arrows here in our framework. So all of the pieces are intended to be related to one another. And we're hoping in the future to test this empirically to see how these pieces are related to each other. But based on the literature and based on our conversations, we have this set so many of the goals and so many of the strategies that could be implemented could be overlapping and have an impact on one dimension, but also on more dimensions across the whole model and the whole framework. So next, I'd like to take you through each of the boxes of the framework. We'll do this as quickly as possible so that we continue to have time for questions. But I think it's important to give some context in terms of understanding what are the background characteristics and identities that we need to understand. What are some of the barriers that are documented in the literature related to each of these different frames? And then what strategies do we have a sense of that work and that can allow us to make progress? There is much more literature on barriers than there are on successful strategies, but both were very key in informing how we developed the first version of the institutional self-assessment in terms of getting an understanding of what things did we want to ask institutions, whether or not they were doing that could be potentially helpful in promoting their faculty diversity. So first, when we talk about institutional context, when we talk about background and barriers, it's really important to acknowledge how institutional level policy can be such an important lever for change that we can't just think about individual departments or individual colleges changing outside of the entire institution, even though at many campuses they function in a somewhat disjointed way that, colleges in many ways are their own little kingdoms. It's really important to think about how the larger institutional culture and climate can accelerate and foster an environment that would lead to greater amounts of change. When we talk about context, we're talking about context within campus and across campus. So we're talking about that nested nature of program, nested within department, nested within college, nested within larger institution. And it really includes thinking about the compositional diversity of the entire campus, as well as the college and specific departments that you're talking about. Any climate issues that might be taking place. So climate issues in STEM, climate issues in engineering, but then also climate issues on the campus and how that might have an impact on whether or not faculty are retained. And then also the degree to which policies and programs are perceived to be in alignment with the institution's core mission, and whether or not there's some tension around whether or not these policies and programs are actually affirming them. In terms of strategies that seem to be helpful or not as helpful, there's some really interesting research on the role of chief diversity officers and whether or not having one is directly related to having increases in faculty diversity. And there's some suggestion that having chief diversity officers are helpful, but they're not necessarily a panacea or a direct path towards increasing your faculty diversity. There's also very few best practices that work across all institutions. That really, it's about thinking about what your institution's needs are, what your institution's challenges are, and then aligning them with practices that make the most sense. Again, institutional commitment and mission must align with the programming. So to get people to buy in, there has to be a connection and clear articulation of the mission aligning with the programming that's being instituted. Having strong vocal senior leaders seems to be really critical. Having faculty or having provosts and presidents and deans out in front of these initiatives and really vocalizing why they're so important seems to be critical to getting the rest of the campus community to fall in line with what the initiatives are. And then finally, that there really needs to be active engagement on the part of deans and department chairs. So thinking about, again, the macro level, the larger institutional discourse, but also what's happening within colleges, within departments, and having those two pieces work together in tandem. So I want to take a moment to talk about recruitment and how we're defining it and how it might be a little bit different than the common ways in which we talk about recruitment. So we defined recruitment as having three different components: that there was an outreach component, that there was a hiring component, and there was a yield component. That outreach were long-term efforts to build a pool outside of a particular position. Hiring was hiring for a very specific position, and yield was whether or not that individual decides to come to your campus. In terms of backgrounds and barriers, oftentimes institutions think in terms of hiring and don't think in terms of outreach. Very, very short term thinking about pool development, which leads them to misvote. That much research has shown us that there is bias and an emphasis on traditional metrics in the hiring process, which can lead to us ignoring really talented women and men of color in the pool. There's a lack of intentionality in terms of how positions are crafted and whether or not they acknowledge the importance of a commitment to diversity and inclusion amongst candidates. There's little strategic outreach. A lot of times it's just send an email out to networks and hope for the best with your fingers crossed. And that there's a lack of formal policy, particularly particularly when it comes to dual career hiring. So that institutions may engage in dual career hiring, which has been shown to be a particularly helpful tool in terms of yielding more women, but they don't have formal policy around it. It's something you have to ask for, and that lack of formality and that lack of intentionality leads to it not really being as effective as it could be. In terms of strategies, what seems to be most helpful is ongoing consistent recruiting when you're not having an open position, and just constantly talking about the strengths of your college, of your specific departments, and identifying talent and knowing where the talent is before the position is available. Developing intentional relationships with alumni, scholars, institutions to be part of that ongoing recruitment process. Making sure that you're strategically disseminating announcements, really thinking intentionally about your plans, about what communities that you want to outreach to. There's been a growing literature and movement toward implementing implicit bias training for the review of applicants. And then finally, being explicit about dual career hiring policies, as well as what a community has to offer, thinking about yield and what would encourage an individual to choose your institution based on the community that they're going to be coming into. I want to speak briefly about transition. It's a dimension that there isn't much literature on, and that Alan and I actually thought was really important in terms of adding to the framework. That there's often a long period of time, particularly when we're talking about new faculty members, between when they're hired and when they actually start at the institution. And that we don't use this time intentionally, and that it certainly could be leveraged to help folks to feel more of a connection to the campus, more of a sense of belonging, and also become more familiar with some of the expectations and what their life is going to look like as a faculty member. In terms of background and barriers, we see generally across new faculty that there's a lack of preparation for the full aspect or the full dimensions of what your job is going to entail. That folks are often trained to be very good researchers, less so in terms of teaching, not at all in terms of service, mentorship, and that some of these things are exacerbated when we look at the experiences of women and men of color because of the lack of quality mentoring that they might experience in their graduate programs. So they might be coming in with less training and a lack of information about what's going to be expected of them in their new roles. When we look at what the challenges are that have been documented in the literature, we see a lack of role clarity connected to the things that I've already mentioned, a lack of confidence and efficacy, so a lack of feeling like you can do the different dimensions of your job very well, and feeling a little bit disconnected socially, feeling like you don't know your colleagues well, you don't know other individuals on campus well, and that can be exacerbated when you might be one of few or the only person with your identity in your department or in your program. In terms of strategies that seem to be most successful, any kind of intervention that integrates both community and skill development seems to be very, very helpful. So thinking about how you help individuals connect and build community and meet each other, but also teach them something that's going to be valuable in their faculty career. And that in many cases, effective mentoring programs can address many of these challenges all at the same time. I think in thinking about transition, we would encourage folks to think about whether or not they could implement some of those strategies earlier, so before an individual arrives on campus rather than later. So the final piece I'd like to talk about today is retention. It's probably the piece that gets the least acknowledged when we have discourses about problems with faculty diversity. But if we look at the literature, there's a lot of conversation about a revolving door, so that in many cases, women, men of color might be hired to replace the woman or the man of color who recently left. That these individuals seem to be less likely to receive tenure, to be promoted, or they have slower rates of tenure and promotion. So it's really important to look at what are some of the barriers, what are some of the challenges that might be leading to some of these inequities. The literature is vast in this area. So contrary to the discourse, there actually is a lot of research that supports that these issues are challenging, and they can be kind of lumped into multiple categories. At the center, though, is an issue of climate, that climate seems to be a challenge across multiple dimensions of faculty members' lives, which has implications for how they develop relationships with their colleagues and supportive networks, how they engage in their work life, so the balance of teaching, research, and service, how they're experienced as faculty members in the classroom, that women, men of color are often questioned about their abilities more, expected to engage in a different level of service than their colleagues. And then finally, how they navigate reward systems and whether or not their unique contributions to the academy are recognized. In terms of strategies, it seems like women and men of color don't necessarily need a different type of skill development. It's more that they need more access to feedback on their research and teaching and support balancing these multiple responsibilities that might be expected of them, clarity and structural changes that help them better navigate advancement processes. It seems to be helpful, much like what we saw in the previous slide on transition. Community development can be very helpful, as well as addressing departmental climate issues directly. And then finally, it's really important to not only have family-friendly policies, but to have those policies be visibly supported so individuals actually take advantage of it. I want to make sure that we get through Alan's slides as well, so we can go on to Alan.
I'm going to cut way back and just make 2 or 3 points. First of all, I was going to reflect on sort of what we have learned as we've had a lot of campuses get involved in this self-assessment, probably almost 40 now or in some point, some place along the line of doing the self-assessment. One thing I think is important is that with the self-assessment tool, each campus or college has to decide how they want to do it. This is kind of a starting point. You've got to adjust it to your context, and many of the campuses have done that. And in developing teams to operate this, either at the institutional level or college level, it really needs to reflect all the components of the college. And I think a couple things, at least at the institutional level, is very important. The teams need to be connected to the provost office. Most provosts probably don't have time to be on the committee or on the team. Most deans probably don't have time to be, but a senior trusted associate in each case should probably be part of the team, so that when issues and questions come up, you can get the deans involved, the dean or the provost involvement very quickly. We also found that it's important to connect to the faculty senate, because if you're going through a self-assessment and you're going to change a lot of policies, sooner or later the faculty senate process will be involved in those policy changes. And the more you can get them involved in that, the better. And at a college level, it might be important to have some of your college representatives involved in this so that they can take issues to the campus as well. On the data template, I'd say that when faculty start talking about it, hundreds of questions get raised about the data template, and you can spend a lot of time talking about it. And we've gotten a lot of feedback, and Kimberly's made adjustments and so forth. But when you hand it over to the institutional research office, they say, sure, some of the stuff is not in one place on the campus, but we know how to get it, and you can get it put together. So if you get your institutional research office, either if you have one within your college or one in the university involved, it's going to be a lot easier, and they do this all the time, putting difficult things together. In terms of some things that come up when you move to a college level of doing this kind of self-assessment, I think you need to think that it's not just a self-assessment, but at some point you're going to build an action plan, or you're going to make some changes. And it's highly likely that some of those changes will have an impact outside the college. So it helps to think about who needs to be involved if we're going to have impact outside the college. And so, again, it may be policies that need to be changed. Suppose you want to make some changes with the tenure and promotion process. Well, some of that you can do in the college, but some of it may require more university-wide kinds of activities. So I just caution you to think about that it may not be something, while you can do a self-assessment entirely within the college, the solutions may be broader. If it's an issue of campus climate on your campus, you can't solve all of that by solving the campus climate in the college. So just think about the context within which you're are in. So that's the caution I wanted to give. I could talk about some more things, but I think it's more important to get back to the question.
Fabulous, Alan. At this point, I want to open this up for questions from you. I know that one question that has come across my chat already is, what time frame is realistic for this self-assessment process? Can Alan, you respond to that?
Well, universities self-wide self-studies have struggled to complete this in a semester. We've tried to shape it that way. It usually runs into summer term, but you typically get all the faculty and others that you can get their part done within the semester, but some of the other leadership tries to wrap this up into a report or something of that sort. So it tends to go in, so it takes almost, I would say, a half year.
Really, any comments to that one?
I think part of it's not so much that the questions are terribly complicated or hard to answer. I think it's figuring out who's the right person to ask, how you get access to all of the information, what you have and what you don't. And that process in many ways is just as informative as what you learn from the self-assessment. Not being able to share a particular data point isn't the worst thing in the world. I think it's more like, well, why don't you have that data point? And that leads to a different set of questions. Or if you don't know whether or not your institution has implemented or your college has implemented one thing or another, that's okay, but why don't you know? And should you know?
That brings up the fact that the self-assessment tool that we've crafted has two parts. One is the data collection part. One is what I'm referring to as the qualitative assessment piece, but it essentially is a yes-no series of questions with the option of having comments put by each of those answers to hold space for exactly what you were talking about. If you don't have the data, why don't you have the data? That's good to put in that comment section of that qualitative part of the tool. So another question that we've got is, what are your recommendations for translating all this self-assessment information into an action plan? Do you have any resources or suggestions?
I'm going to say something vague and philosophical first, and then I think, Alan, you can say something thoughtful and intentional about process. And I'm thinking about this mostly because I sat on a dissertation defense today, and the student did a wonderful job of nuancing, like describing all of their findings in a very nuanced way. But I wanted to know what the story was. Like, so when we back out from the individual findings, what's the story? And I think that that's one of the first key steps in moving from institutional self-assessment to action plan, that we're asking you to check all of these boxes, and there's no like percentage of numbers that make you right. So right. Like checking yes to everything is not the goal. But what the goal is to be able to take a step away from it and get a better understanding of what are we doing well, what are we not doing so well, what have we not even begun to think about, and where might some of our challenges be that we want to address with an action plan. Alan?
Well, we have produced a guidebook for the institutional self-assessment study, and it has a section on action plans and kind of a timeline for them and the sorts of things you need to do. And when you get to the action planning, you may want to rethink your team. In other words, the team that did the self-assessment, some of those members may want to continue, but you may want to perhaps bring in more departmental people, because a lot of your action planning may differentially involve departments. Some need to do more. You may find out some need to do more. And I think it's important in action planning also to think about reinforcing the things you're doing well. This is not just what's wrong with us and how we're going to get fixed. It's what are we doing well? What do we have our challenges in? How can we fashion a sort of systematic way to address all those boxes that Kimberly talked about? Some by saying, hey, we're doing pretty good on this, but we haven't even thought about this, so we've got to start from scratch to do something here. In terms of satisfaction, have we ever done a coach study that told us whether faculty really like teaching here or not? And if you come out very badly on a coach study, you might want to do some things that brings faculty around to be happier. So those are the things that would go into an action plan. There's what you find out. And
Alan, you and I have had multiple conversations about change management versus project management. Can you sort of speak to that when it comes to action plan?
Well, I think in the universities, historically we do this. Okay, we want to make a change. Well, this department or this faculty member doesn't like it. Well, do we try to address that? No, we try to work around it. Well, these other people want to make the change, so we'll make it. It's the coalition of the willing. And if we didn't have coalitions of the willing, universities probably couldn't get any place. And so that's a form. But sometimes we may find barriers within our action plans. If we're really going to make changes, some people may not like it or may resist it. And so so we know what our goals are in our project and how we paced it out over 3 or 4 years. But if we run up against barriers, we need to think ahead of time, who's going to resist this and how might we work to help them not be resisting factors. So in the business world nowadays, on big changes in industry or in business, they have a project management team, but they also have a change management team that's separate. They work in coordination, but the change management team says, what do we got to do if we're going to have successful change? We kind of know how to do that in the universities, but we don't do it as intentionally, I think, as the business world says we need to if we want to have effective change. So part of what we're recommending is we think in terms of change management in the university as well.
And by creating a distinction between project management and change management is thinking about what do we need to do to support the people engaged in the change process? Who needs to know about this? How can we leverage their expertise and provide them with tools and resources to foster and facilitate the change? Okay, we're at the top of the hour, and I know that there will be other questions. Please feel free to share with us after the webinar. This is the first step in your learning process or your journey here, of which we can provide support tools. Again, I want to reiterate what our asks are. Please use our tool. A lot of work went into this. This is truly a state-of-the-art tool. Please contribute to the Dean's pilot project, which will help us build a national gender equity database based on sub-questions from the self-assessment tool. And check out our app. Also, some of the next steps are, of course, we're going to say, okay, sign that pledge, go to the listserv, look at the prior webinar with Virginia Valiant, read her book, and plan for participating in the next webinar showcase that we have. Also, some of the resources that we have on the website are documented here. Please explore our website. It's full of rich resources. And again, back to the pilot. Really trying to poke people to get involved with the pilot. Got half a dozen people right now, only want a couple more. So with that in mind, I have one final request, which is, I really need to get some feedback to NSF about the value of this webinar, whether it was helpful for you in decision making that you're engaged in. Here's the place to provide feedback. Ultimately, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Alan and Kimberly, for your expertise and for putting your effort into designing such a fabulous tool. And we look forward to ongoing conversation. Thank you, everybody. Take care.